So we have been talking about this reality that we're seeing in most every church, this reality of younger people turning away from the faith, and, or at least not necessarily from the faith. We talked about that. Sometimes from our church, just from our way of living out that faith. And so we've been looking at some of these reasons that we saw several weeks ago in these surveys. We looked last week at the first reason a little more deeply, that churches seem overprotective. We talked about the fact our faith as Christians doesn't require that we disengage from the world. In fact, our faith requires that we are part of the world around us, as Jesus was. That we're present for the people around us. That we share in God's love. 16 talks about. We talked about being light of the world. We talked about 2 Corinthians 5, where God is reconciling the world to himself in Christ. He doesn't see the world as an enemy to be ignored and then destroyed. He sees the world as an estranged loved one to be reconciled. And so we talked a little bit then about how we prepare our kids, our younger generations, our young adults to go out into the world with confidence in their faith and in their role as followers of Jesus and sharers of the gospel. So that was kind of where we went last week. I don't know that we got through all the stuff I wanted to talk about necessarily. I can't remember. Did we talk about? I've been thinking about this idea that we need to teach each other. We need to teach that the world is created by God, and it's still a place in which His glory can be seen, His grace can be seen. That there's beauty there that He created, and that takes seriously the perspectives of a lot of our young adults who have good friends who aren't Christians, and they don't want to have this sense that they have to abandon them or disconnect from those good friends and those relationships and those experiences. So I think as Christians, we need to be able to teach that there is beauty there. Sure, there's stuff in the world that can take you away from God, that needs to be avoided and rejected out of hand. But there's a lot of good there too. There's a lot of beauty there too. And to take that seriously and to teach that perspective is, I think, pretty important. I don't think any of us mostly want a faith that requires this position of constant antagonism toward the world, right? I don't want that. I don't want to feel like, that my faith requires me to constantly be at odds with the world. Jesus, that was not what Jesus modeled for us. And so I think we have to teach, because I think that in some way or the other, some of our young adults are getting the idea that faith is about rejecting the world. It's about rejecting the people out there. It's about rejecting everything about it. And that's a tough thing to teach when Jesus seemed to teach just the opposite of that. Comments or thoughts or things you want to share? Then I'm going to take it to your agreement.
Well, I'll just step in on that, because I mean, I think we've traditionally been able to sort of see, Americans in general are oftentimes able to see the work of God in creation or the like, and the beauty of God's creation. We identify that with wilderness, like in How Great Thou Art, the trees and the mountains and all that type of stuff. Other cultures don't necessarily do that. And I'm not sure really the younger generation is as much focusing on seeing the good in creation there as much as seeing the good of creation in the way sometimes people interact with each other and the like. And so, I think that sometimes gets a negative reaction from people. Younger generation really values love and kindness and the like. And oftentimes they get a negative reaction to that because our generation focuses all on, well, it's love, but it's misdirected, right? And I think the younger generation focuses a lot on the fact that, well, that may be, but it's still love. That there's good intent there, and it's not like they're excusing it, but that they're sort of seeing we're seeing the glass as more than half empty. They're seeing there's something still in the glass, and they're taking a more positive approach to it, where we see what's missing or what's not there, and we focus on that. You can see God at work even in fractured and inadequate relationships if you look at the good that people or the desirable things, even if they're misdirected, even if they're not quite what the ideal would be. And it's a difference in approach that I think is a big difference in worldview, perhaps sometimes.
I agree. I think you're right, and I do think that we can recognize that God is. I mean, I don't think any of us think that we have this theology that God just has nothing to do with the world around us and just rejects it out of hand. I think we all would recognize. I mean, Jesus talked about God sending His rain on the just and the unjust, right? What the earlier generations sometimes called is it common grace, and with common grace, which common to all of us. God gives all of us a degree of this common grace, and that's just one of the things that came to me as we were talking about this tendency for some of our younger generations to view the church as overprotective. I think one of the ways we can start to address that concern is to demonstrate that we see the beauty around us, and I think we all do. I think that's perhaps a misunderstanding that has sometimes been perpetuated by, I don't know, some extremes, maybe some from media, that the church is just rejecting the world out of hand, when I don't think any of us think it's that simple and that black and white, that cut and dry. We all believe that God is active in the world around us, even when it's maybe hard to see Him in some ways. I suggest that we need to teach young adults. We need to acknowledge that they might have to be ready for some hostility to their faith at times, but not to present that as necessarily something to be avoided or something to be feared or something to be that should cause them to lose their bearings, but to give them some tools for responding to that with love and with grace and with forgiveness, and to help them when it happens to process it in prayer and through scripture and through worship and with the church. And I think that takes some things seriously. The reality is sometimes our faith as Christians doesn't fit well with the people around us. And sometimes because of that, there will be some rejection. There will be some discomfort. There will even be sometimes occasionally downright hostility. But that's not unusual for a believer through the centuries. And that's something that we learn to cope with and to process and to work through and to do it together as we should do all of this.
But Patrick, this is Christy.
Hi, Christy.
Hi. It's rare in my observations that we're being criticized for being too loving or too generous or too, accepting of people for where they are. Even if we say those things, I'm afraid that what tends to be the criticism, what you're talking about, the hostility, is, well, you go to church, does that mean you think, fill in the blank on whatever, does that mean you think, gay people are going to hell, or, people, all those things. Well, I don't want to get into the specific issues because then we could debate those all night, but unfortunately, I would like to have, I would like it to be what, these, I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to struggle with this idea of us standing up for the faith when what they're often criticizing are things that I'm struggling with my own critiques, if that makes sense. I don't know. Maybe I'm saying too much.
Well, I think you're right. I think very often some of the things we're criticized for, and that's one of the responses in some of the material I've read has been, that churches are known for what they're against more than what they're for. And I have to wonder, how did it come to that? How did that come about? I mean, sure, we're against some things. We would say that some things are not, and against is a broad term, right? When I say I'm against some certain behaviors, I don't mean I'm against people who are involved in those, or I'm rejecting them out of hand. I'm just saying that there are some things that biblically I can't support, I can't be a part of, and can't encourage. But that's certainly not the sum total of what the gospel should be. We're against these things, and so somewhere the message has gotten lost. The message got scrambled.
When I was in college, my college roommate, and this isn't modern, obviously, this was 30 years ago, but she went to Bible study with me one night. And when she was talking to her, I think it was her grandmother, on the phone, and said that she had gone with her roommate to church. Her grandmother, who went to, I think, an Episcopalian church, said, "Oh, what church does she go to?" And she said, "Oh, she goes to the Church of Christ." And her grandmother said, "Oh, I know. Those are the people that think they're the only ones going to heaven." And
heard that before, Dan.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's a kind of minor one, but
Yeah. So I mean, and you're right. I think sometimes the rejection, and it may not be our fault personally. It may not be my fault personally. It might be, but it might not be my fault personally that the church is known for those things. The reality is, though, that sometimes it is. Sometimes that's the idea that people have, and it takes some work to counter that with no. I mean, we want to be known for what Jesus was known for. We want to be known for him and for that message. And I think we would all agree with that. It's just hard sometimes to overcome that kind of mindset that exists. And sometimes that mindset exists because we have not exactly been faithful to the gospel.
Well, and sometimes recently, one of the big issues is that I hear from some younger Christians, including some, my daughter and the like. If you say that you're a member of a sort of evangelical church, there's immediately a perception that you are politically way to the right, and that you voted for certain people. And that is very off-putting in certain circles. I mean, that in itself is a barrier these days sometimes.
I mean, how did that happen? And why don't people who grow up in specific churches, why can't they look at their church like us and say, yeah, but that's not all Christians, because I grew up in this congregation, this church, and I saw something different.
Well, I think it happened ever since with Reagan and the moral majority and the like, that conservative Christians put themselves out there very publicly, certain ones did, and got the speaking roles and got the national attention. And this group of Christians ended up getting a label because it sought a label as politically active and conservative. And it's something that I've been wrestling with ever since high school, because as some of you might have recognized from time to time, I'm not necessarily liberal in the line of politics, but I'm certainly not in line with what people assume I'm in line for. But you get that label right at the start, and it turns many people off right from the outset.
I get that. I get why people who don't really have much direct experience at church would have that opinion. My question is, if we get young people growing up in a specific church, how have we not been able to, what has gone wrong that we've not been able to show them something different?
Patrick,
I think what stands out to, you want to go ahead, Chrissy?
No, go ahead, Colette. I've already talked.
Hi. I think what stands out to me is I was young once, and I, in the church, would bring up these types of questions and was shut down. I mean, would have major arguments, or the women in the church were sent to talk to me about it and to say, no, these are our views and this is how we should think. And, the older women teaching the younger women. And thank God I had a voice and I had a mind. And I said, this has nothing to do with my faith. This is an opinion and I don't agree with it. And so it was just intense when you bring something up that's different than what evangelicals or what they think the Church of Christ stands for. You're shut down. And so I can imagine as a younger person, I story after story, we're talking about politics now, but I remember when I expressed to an older Christian woman that I looked up to that I wanted to write books, about counseling and about caring. She says, oh no, we don't do, just stupid stuff. Excuse the term stupid, but just stuff that would make you shut up and stop talking to people in the church and then going to the world to be encouraged or to talk about the things that you had a dream or a vision to do. And I think it's the message when the young people come to us, we better be ready to let their voice be heard and validate what they want to do and what they want to say, because I personally was shut down on so many occasions that I didn't talk about politics. I didn't talk about my beliefs in things because it was met with such ugliness or closeness, maybe not ugliness, but just people were closed off to it because it didn't fit.
Yeah, and it happens in the the political side that Ron brought up too. It's not just outside of it's not just people that aren't familiar with the church. I've had many experiences where someone assumes they know my politics because they only think they think a Christian must have this political view. And so there is no entertainment of the idea that politics is separate from Christianity, and my Christianity informs my decisions, but it's not written in the Bible which party you're supposed to support. And I have had people assume they know my political views because they hear I go to church or because they're also in the Church of Christ. And that's, I think that's explains a lot of it.
I think what I'm hearing and what I've seen and dealt with and struggled with and encountered throughout my life is the American church as a whole. I'm talking evangelicals, Catholic, Episcopalians, Orthodox, we deal with that serving two masters problem. Far too often, we allow ourselves to be defined by our Americanness or our political standpoints and not be defined by by the gospel. We're not living, we're trying to live a life according to both according to both sides. You get what I'm saying? We have a tendency to go, well, you know, my politics is this, and now I have to find a way to make sure that aligns with my faith, and my faith aligns with my politics. And it really, you know, the gospel says we're supposed to live according to the gospel. We're supposed to act charitably, act with compassion, to love, to share the good news. And in doing all that, that becomes our sole focus. And when we're living that life, our politics will fall into that. You know, our politics will fall into place, but we work so hard to create this identity, you know, the American conservative religious identity or the American liberal religious identity. And it's like, oh, well, this is what our faith/politics means. And it's our faith. We should be defined by our faith. We should allow our faith only to define us. And one thing we struggle with is that we far too often allow all the other outside aspects of our life to define us. And then we're confused when people say, oh, Christians do this. And it's like, well, that's not, it's like, well, that's not the case. Well, when you meet a real Christian, it's not the case, and I'm not calling somebody not a real Christian because they have a political view, but it's so we're all too often just following the wrong master with it and not following Christ.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think I'm hearing some really, really good stuff here that I think is kind of important as we sort of process some of how we respond to this overprotective, this idea that the church is overprotective. And I think it comes kind of down to, Colette talked about listening and hearing and letting people know that their questions are reasonable and their beliefs can be held in common with their faith, and that their faith can inform those, and that they can do that in a community in which they are loved and valued and find a place and a role and a purpose as Perry's talking about in sharing the good news and living out the gospel, because the gospel is something not just to be told, but to be lived out. And that perhaps that's how we begin to sort of turn this trend back in the other direction. I gotta think that if we have a lot of young adults growing up in churches where some of these things are happening, it's going to make a difference. And we're not going to, so anyway.
Well, let me just share, you probably won't, I'll just share something, that happened to me in the 80s when I was at Lipscomb. And, I was talking to a young lady from Alabama at the college, and she looked at me and she said, I just don't understand how you can be a Christian and a Democrat. And my quick answer back to her is, don't ask your granddad that, because I was pretty sure he was going to have been a Democrat out down in Alabama. But, if you're asked that, or you intuit that that's the attitude around you, maybe you're going to be pretty convinced that this is not the group of Christians for me. And you're not going to stay. Now, I stuck it out. You couldn't get rid of me that easily. But, other people, they see the unwelcome sign and they're just going to go. And
yeah.
I'm sorry.
So I was agreeing with you. I think one of the things that keeps coming up in these surveys and in our response to them is that a lot of times, I mean, you know, you stayed, Ron, you synthesized some things and your personal beliefs versus your faith, and you work through some of those struggles. Not everybody does that, and apparently, a lot of people don't do that. And I call your attention back to that number that said it was it 70% of those who left said they didn't intend to leave, but something along the way happened that either caused them to leave or did not make it compelling enough to stay. and so I guess that's what I was getting at when I asked, you know, what has happened? Where is the disconnect? That people who grow up in churches that presumably aren't on the extreme that sometimes the church is portrayed as all being on, yet we're having a hard time keeping those generations. So I just want to point out again how very, very often it seems that young adults who are leaving have not done so, you know, with as soon as I get out of high school and get off to college, I'm never going to church again. That is not the majority. And yet it happens. And it's happening over and over.
I'm going to make a comment or a question. I don't want to stir anything up, but I wonder if part of them leaving is because they've never really made the decision within their own hearts to truly follow Jesus. Because that was certainly initially for me. I did it because, you know, I didn't want to go to hell, and my parents went to church every Sunday and I was there, and, you know, it's the right thing to do. But that was not a converting of my heart and saying, I did Luke 9. It wasn't, I'm giving up everything to follow Jesus, and I understand what my commitment is to that. That came in my young adult life that we're talking about when you leave. And thank God somebody reached out to me at that time to help me make a decision about that. So I just wonder if kids or anyone who's baptized at 13 and younger, if it's not their true decision, it could be difficult. And I know that's the parent's role or whoever's helping that kid to make sure they're understanding what they do. But I think those are the ones that are still around perhaps. And those that are just doing it, what, it's just wondering. Because
I think also, Colette, that understanding is an issue. Because sometimes children are baptized without the full understanding of what it means to be in Christ. And the other thing I was thinking as we're discussing this, these are not discussions that are brought up in the Church of Christ. Not that I've seen lately. I mean, these are not things we're talking about with our young adults. It doesn't seem that these things are discussed. So that could be some of it.
I'd say a couple of things. And one of them is, and I think it's really interesting. You mentioned kids 13, 14, teenagers, whatever, young adults are baptized without a full understanding of what that means in the Christian life.
Sometimes adults are baptized too without really being
all of us.
Right.
I think all of us have been baptized without a full understanding of what that means, right? And Paul allows that.
I mean, you should have some understanding of what you're going into, but I know people who have been baptized just because they felt the pressure from a family member or a friend or what have you. And they have said, I didn't understand this fully. I've known people that had to become older adults and say, you know what, I need to be rebaptized because I didn't really understand what I was doing when I came into the church. And I mean, I think that's an honest thing for a person.
I think that's, I think that happens, absolutely. And I just wanted to play off that for a minute because I think, and it sort of plays into our second point a little bit as well. I think one of the things that we discover at times is, we get people baptized and then well, they're done, right?
But they're not.
and that's just the start. I mean, that's just the beginning. That's where
I grew up. I came into the church living in the South, and when I became a member of when I was baptized and became a member of the Church of Christ, we had classes that were for new converts, where you were with people who say were seasoned and had more understanding, to make sure you're understanding and how to study the Bible and how to be into it and stuff. I think somewhere along the way, we've gotten away from that. People are just, as a minister I know used to say, they're just getting wet and coming up. But you're not teaching them, or we're failing to teach.
I do think, however we do it, I do think that's something that ought to be continuing. That all of us are in process, right?
It's on the job learning forever.
Yeah, we're all learning and growing. We're all being made in the image of Christ, as Paul puts it. We're all being renewed, each day, and we're all going through that process that the Holy Spirit does in us of sanctifying us and purifying us and helping us to grow more like Jesus. The second reason that I want to start talking about tonight, that we talked about, that people have left, teens and 20-somethings experience of Christianity is shallow. That was one of the reasons given in a lot of this material, that their experience of Christianity is shallow. They're walking away because they don't think there's much there. And I think some of the things you're talking about really sort of connect with that idea. That people are, they're going to this place at a certain time of a week, and they're going through certain motions, and they're listening to songs, and maybe they like some of the songs, or maybe they don't like some of the songs, and they're singing along with the songs they like. They're hearing somebody stand up and talk about the Bible, and maybe it's interesting, and maybe it's not. And they're doing the Lord's Supper, and they're doing these things, but it's to them, it seems to be a very surface experience.
It's like, how do I apply this? A lot of them will say, you know what, how this doesn't relate to me every day. I mean, depending on what that message was brought at that time. And so if they're not getting anything from it, it's easy to just say, okay, well, you know what, we're just going through the motions because this is what we've been told to do. And
so we had 31% said that church is boring. This sort of a catch-all. Church is boring. It's just boring. I think when you hear that, though, one of the things is sort of dismiss that a little bit. But I think when you hear church is boring, there's more behind that. It has to do, I think, with a perception of relevance, a perception of importance. This matters. It matters a great deal. We don't think, if something matters to us, we don't think it's boring, right? If something's important to us, if we see the relevance of it, it's not boring to us.
You know, when my girls were at home and Colette had her class on Wednesday night, they really related to different things that they were discussing with her. Mm-hmm. And those are things that, I mean, that's just one thing, but I mean, that's something you got to be able to reach more than a few. You got to be able to reach enough so that that interest is there and they want to know more. Why is it important for me to have a spiritual walk and act a certain way and be a certain way, or be concerned about the company that I keep? Why is that important? And those are things that need to, and it's how that's taught that makes it effective.
So I mean, you've got a quarter of young adults who have left saying faith is not relevant to my career or interests. You hear a whole lot of I and me here, and again, the preacher in me is tempted to dismiss that. Well, you got to have more, you got to have more interest than just, you're direct, but there's a lot behind that. There's a lot behind a statement like that.
And would dismissing that reveal your own
self-interest?
Yeah, right.
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
What I or these statements that you eventually extrapolate out of that?
Sure. Sure. But all these things have to. It's more than just. Well, it's boring to me. It's boring for a reason. The Bible is not taught clearly or often enough. 23% said that. 20% said God seems missing from my experience of church. So, I mean, I think this is a really interesting category for us to grapple with, pretty honestly, and deal with some of these questions pretty honestly. This is my least favorite category, by the way, for the obvious reason that I spend a lot of time trying to communicate the urgency and the importance and the relevance of the gospel to people. And so you read stuff like this and you kind of go, well, shoot, what am I doing? What am I doing wrong? What's going on here? But it can't be about that. It can't be about, I don't like to hear that. It's got to be about, all right, so what do we as the church do? One of the things is the only communicator can't be the guy on Sunday. That's the one thing I've figured out. If the only communicator is the guy on Sunday, we're in trouble. If the only one communicating, the guy like May, you talked about your daughters relating to Colette's class. That's as it ought to be, right? If you only have the one communicator, the guy on Sunday, you're already playing from behind. So a couple of responses that came up in my mind, and then, please feel free. We got about 15 more minutes. Please feel free to respond to any of these. I was thinking of Philippians 1, 9 through 11. Philippians 1, 9 through 11 says, "This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what's best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God." Now, if I read that right, Paul's saying, you don't start with knowledge and get to love. You start with love, and that leads to the abounding of knowledge and insight and wisdom and understanding and discernment. But you start with not the knowledge stuff. You start with the relation. You start where we all start as Christians. It begins with the love of Christ for us, the love of God for us in Jesus Christ. And then we learn and we grow as we grow in that love. You need to, you want to work on your walk with Christ. One of the things that is best is you go find somebody to serve and love the way Jesus did. You go and take that seriously. You take that relationship seriously. And if you do, you will grow in knowledge. You will grow in understanding. You'll know more and more what the will of God is. But you start with that relational aspect. And where that relational aspect ought to be happening, besides in your family, is in your church. That stuff ought to be happening. So, May, I think your daughters related to Colette because they knew Colette cared for them. They knew Colette loved them. They had that relationship with her. That was a relational thing. And it made a difference to them because so I think
it was what they were discussing more than anything. I mean, the things that they brought up. Because sure they said, they had a voice. And a lot of times they would say, because I know when Taylor moved to Dallas, she went to a couple of congregations. She went to a congregation that Celeste Pratt had referred her to, and she met the young lady. And like she said, it was such a big congregation. She just felt like she was just sitting there. You know, she said no one ever spoke to her other than the one person that Celeste had introduced her through, through social media. And she just felt, she was like, they weren't friendly. Then she went to another congregation and we visited a couple of times. And I mean, they were okay, but they just seemed a little, I don't know, like, I couldn't tell that I was at the Church of Christ a couple of times. I felt like I might have been at some other worship service. That's how I felt because of how they.
So you mentioned a couple of things there that again underline this relational aspect. She sat in that pew and nobody talked to her. Nobody cared about her. Nobody had a connection. So she felt disconnected. She said
it was too big.
Unwelcome.
Let me jump in real quick.
I think we start here, and I have a question to ask. And the question that I have to ask is simply this: how in the world can we possibly bore people with the gospel?
I think we bore them. I got to ask, because I was thinking about this when you were talking earlier. When people come to you as a leader or me leading a Sunday school class or whatever the case is, and they say they're bored, or they say that they're not getting anything from it. This is the stance I take. I go, wow, how can I help you? Tell me what you think you need. And I think that's really important because I've had, well, you guys know, most of the young people that have gone through since I've been here for my 10 years, these are the kind of conversations we've had. And a lot of times they felt turned away. Like, well, that's what happened when you were in college. That's not the kind of church we're going to have here. And I think that's problematic. I've heard some of the comments just recently that, oh, you're thinking about I. Well, yeah. And that's where I think I'm a little bit different. I do think if you come to me and it's I want to spend all my energy on that I, because if my little foot hurts, then my whole body hurts. And I think that's where we drop the ball, that we don't stop and hear the I. We think they're being selfish, and they may be. I'm not here to judge that. I just think when they say, ouch, this hurts, or I'm bored, or I'm not getting anything, I think that's where the ears need to go, wow, let me hear this. What can I do? You want a ban? Up to the points of things we can't do, of course, or won't do because of our tradition. And that's fine. But we try to at least meet them halfway. And I felt like some of the things the ladies have said to me in the class that they haven't felt, and not necessarily with Northwest, I'm talking about their Christianity and when they've gone to different churches, et cetera. They haven't felt met halfway. They didn't talk about sex before marriage. They didn't talk about, or if they said they were bored, it was, this is not college. And I just think that's why they leave, because no one's listening. I still am back to the listening point, but I do know people can be bored and not want to be a part of worship, or a certain kind of songs are being sung, and it just takes the life out and all the life leaves out of worship. I'm speaking from personal experience. And I always go up to Ron and say, thank you for leading, because it helps. And you can say, you shouldn't be here for singing and work, but that's a part of my worship. I have quiet times just listening to music sometimes.
And sometimes you just have to explain that to young adults that, because people get hung up and say, well, your worship is not to be pleasing for you. It's supposed to be pleasing to God. Explain that better to them so that they understand what you are trying to convey. It's how, again, it's how it's taught. It's how it's taught to them and how they receive it. It's how you'll receive something, how it's taught to you.
Well, ideally, it's both. But, I want to just affirm something that Colette said. The reason why people get bored, the reason why is we oftentimes are preaching and teaching and suggesting that Christianity is rules-based. And that's what we're focusing on. And what Colette's talking about is when people start to get past the rules and people start sort of letting down their hair and getting real with one another. confessing problems that they have in following the rules, maybe, or understanding the rules. But, you know, the other thing is I have problems with the whole focus on rules. You mentioned, how can people be bored with the gospel? A lot of churches don't preach the gospel. I mean, that's not what their focus is. I was at a church not that long ago when I was asking, well, what had been taught recently in the classes? When was the last time you went through a gospel? They couldn't remember the last time they had a class on any of the gospels, right? So I really think sometimes the point is rules are shallow. We think sometimes by following all the rules, which is hard to do, look at the Pharisees, right? Somehow that's going to lead people to Christ. I think we preach Christ and try to get people to understand Christ and know who Jesus is. And then the rules will come along. You know, that part, you know, will be supplemented by Paul and stuff. But I agree with you, Patrick, that if we're really focusing on getting people to know Christ and getting to know Christ in action in the church, and that means, by the way, young people also look at what churches are doing. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of churches that the poor have to come to them, right? They never go to the poor. They never visit people in jail. They never do, you know, and I think young people pretty quickly catch that this is a bunch of people meeting together to sort of jolly each other up on Sunday with some songs and some words from the pulpit and the like. But what are they doing? And without the witnessing, without the getting real, without the actual evidence that the church is in motion, doing the things that Christ recommended, it's going to be hard to sell to young people, I think.
I think you make a good point, Ron. I think the other thing that we have to be careful of, and I do think we bore the kids with this sometimes, is I think we actually quite often water down the truth. We don't talk about what truth is and what sin is and you know what that is. We water down the topics that we're going to talk about. And with my experience with the work that I've done with the youth group and with my two girls from personal experience, this generation is used to talking about things openly and directly, and they want to talk and be listened and heard. And Colette, I wish my girls would have been able to sit through your class, but I can tell you, you know, Nicole at our last church, you know, every young woman was required to go through a quarter of a class that Nicole taught before they went into the youth group. And they covered hard, real topics. And kids reach out to her that are now 24 or 25 years old, remembering what they talked about on these hard topics. So I think what we have to be really, really careful with this generation is I think we can get caught up in watering down the truth or watering down the sin, and at the same time, waterboarding the sinner. And they see right through that. What I have seen with this generation is they have no problem talking about the sin and being able to separate that from the sinner. We've got to love the sinner. And if we're killing the sinner, and they can handle that truth of that. So we just got to be really balanced in terms of.
And they need to see it modeled in us, right, yeah. Steve? That's the thing, that we say what it is and we're hard line. Then I've got to make sure that I'm modeling what I am, who I say I am, a Christian. That whatever we're talking about, be it telling truth, be it swearing, be it drunkenness, whatever we're talking about, abstinence, if you're a single person, then they need to see that in me. If I'm, you know, my obligation is not to them, it's to Christ, but they need to see it, to see it.
And even on some topics, talking about it and saying, this doesn't make sense to my human mind. It doesn't. I look at this particular topic and I don't like it.
Right.
But it doesn't matter. All I can do, if I am modeling myself to Christ, which there's no difference to modeling myself to Christ and modeling myself to the Word, is to be able to look at it and say, what does it say? then that's what it means, because I'm not as smart as God. And then how do we proceed forward from that? You know, but I think they see us very often, and I've seen this with them, not being able to distinguish between what sin is and what a sinner is. And those are two very different things. We all sin. And, you know, our job as the church is not to judge those that are outside the church. We can judge internally, but we are to help them try to find Christ and what the truth is and what it means to model. So I'll hush. That's too much for me. Sorry.
No, that's great.
I think, Patrick, it's Christy. I was curious about the part of the questionnaire where people said that we're not teaching the Bible clearly.
Yeah.
I actually don't always think the Bible's clear. I actually think I'm not. It's the Word of God. I'm not. This is not an actual. I think it's reflective of the long years and many writers and types of writing, and I think that it's not a rule book, and I wonder if we could honor that a little bit more. We would take out some of this idea that, well, it's all clearly states right there. All you have to read is 2 Corinthians, you know, I mean, we just want to not recognize the richness and the complexity and how it doesn't always tell us exactly what to do and what I'm doing right now. And if we acknowledged that, I think the young people would say, oh, wow, I'm not the only one that thinks that. I'm not saying that's true for every single person. I know many people need the rule book, but it doesn't work for me that way.
No, I get that. And again, all I'm saying is I can respect how you're approaching that. And I'm telling you, the way I approach that is to look at a mirror and go, I defer to God. It's not rocket science. There are certainly things that are confusing. There are certainly things that are challenging. But if I'm struggling with something when I'm reading it, my reaction that I've chosen to take is to say, I'm just going to go with what the Bible says. It's the inspired word of God, and just go with that. And that I'm talking about application of what it means. I'm not talking about being a jerk in our approach to things on that. That's the point I was trying to make.
And I think we would all affirm that we're under the authority of Scripture. It's just sometimes it is a struggle to know ourselves and to know together how that authority works and what it looks like and how it does shape us. I think that's the point.
But my point, Patrick, is this class that we've had where we're having real discussions, right? And Christy and I can have a conversation and debate something back and forth and do it in a rational and loving way. Kids want that. Our young adults want to have real discussions. And that's really the point that I was trying to make. They don't want the watered down stuff. They're used to they're exposed to so much more than we were exposed to. I didn't even have the internet. They can click their finger and read 42 different versions of anything that they want within that. And their mind thinks different than this old 48-year-old man and wants to deal with things differently. And I think sometimes we just don't, I don't know if we're scared to talk about it or what, but I think we would do better to engage in those open discussions, to have disagreements where we needed to have disagreements, but allow them to see we're all battling through this stuff together and we're all on the same journey.
Absolutely, I agree.
Steve, thank you for what you just said. That's very true. Thank you very much.
So we need to wind down for tonight. However, so we're gonna pick up here. So I want you to be thinking about how are we boring people with the gospel? If we are proclaiming the gospel, I mean, in the Bible, it doesn't bore people, right? Some people hate it. Some people respond very negatively to it, but it doesn't bore them. So what's gone wrong that we're boring people with the gospel if that's what we're doing? or maybe we're boring people with something other than the gospel. That's a very real possibility too. And how do we, what is it about some young adults' experience that they're not seeing the Bible taught? And where, how do we respond to that? How do we reply to that? And I think we have some good starts on some of those conversations. So spend a week with that. We'll come back next Wednesday and pick up there and continue to discuss that. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all.
Good class.
Thank you, guys.
Good
Good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
You guys have a nice week.
Hi, Laura and John and Josh. I did speak to you earlier.
How are you doing?
Okay, and Christy.